Imagine this. You are a young priest arriving at Winchester Cathedral in the year 1350. The bishop greets you warmly in the cold stone entrance, his ringed hand blessing your devotion to celibacy and your vow to serve God without the corruption of flesh. His voice echoes through the vaulted ceiling as he speaks of purity and sacrifice. Then he hands you a leather pouch containing 18 iron keys. Your new duty is managing his establishments across the Thames in Suffolk. Not churches or monasteries, but houses where over 1,000 women work in the pleasure trade. Your vow of chastity remains sacred and binding. But administering his empire of entertainment, that is merely administrative duty in service to the cathedral. The contradiction hits you like a physical blow as you stand there holding those keys. Behind you rise the magnificent arches of one of England's greatest cathedrals. Before you stretches a business operation that would make modern entertainment moguls envious in its scope and profitability. The bishop is not embarrassed. He is not secretive. He is simply explaining your responsibilities the same way he might assign you to manage church properties or collect tithes from farmers. This is not scandal. This is standard practice for a wealthy medieval bishop. What you do not yet understand is that this moment represents one of history's greatest institutional hypocrisies, a system so normalized that it functioned openly for centuries. The Winchester operation was not hidden in shadows or whispered about in dark corners. The establishments had official signs hanging above their doors. The largest facility, known as the Boar's Head, could accommodate more than 100 clients per night. Its wooden sign swung in the river breeze, painted with the bishop's personal coat of arms. The cardinal's hat specialized in wealthier clientele, charging premium rates for women certified clean and disease-free by the bishop's own physicians. These were not cramped secret rooms, but purpose-built facilities with distinctive architecture. Large windows faced the street where women displayed themselves to potential customers. The buildings were substantial investments, constructed specifically for this trade with the same care given to any profitable commercial property. The financial records that survived in church archives reveal the staggering scale of this operation. Each establishment generated between £20 and £40 weekly in gross revenue. In modern currency, that represents hundreds of thousands of pounds annually per location. Multiply this across 18 separate facilities operating simultaneously, and the Winchester operation alone generated more wealth than most noble estates. The bishop's cut was structured like any business partnership. Of every transaction, typically 4 pence paid by the customer, the woman kept 1 penny for herself. The establishment took 1 penny for overhead costs, including building maintenance and supplies. 2 pennies went directly into the cathedral treasury. The bishop was not merely tolerating this trade. He was its primary beneficiary and most powerful operator. The licensing system revealed the sophisticated bureaucracy supporting these operations. Women needed official permits to work, renewed annually for a substantial fee paid to the bishop's administrators. They paid weekly sin taxes directly to church coffers, calculated as percentages of their earnings. Special fees were charged for working on holy days. Although entertainment services were technically prohibited during Lent, this ban was widely ignored upon payment of additional fines. The entire system was documented in official church records with the same careful attention given to tithes, land rents, and other revenue sources. Scribes recorded names, fees paid, and infractions with bureaucratic precision. These were not illegal operations hidden from authorities. They were legal businesses operating under explicit episcopal license and protection. The women themselves became known throughout England as the Winchester geese, a term that branded them as property of the bishop's estate. This was not affectionate nickname but legal designation with specific implications. As Winchester geese, these women fell under the bishop's direct legal jurisdiction rather than city courts. They were required to live within designated areas of Suffolk known as the Liberty of the Clink, a district under complete episcopal control. They wore distinctive clothing mandated by law, marking them as separate from respectable women. Red or yellow accessories identified them instantly in any crowd. They could not enter certain areas of London without special permission. They were legally categorized not as criminals but as licensed service providers operating under church authority. The recruitment system operated with disturbing efficiency and official sanction. The annual Winchester Fair was ostensibly a hiring market for domestic servants. Young women from the countryside arrived seeking employment as kitchen maids, laundresses, or seamstresses. Instead, they found the highest-paying positions were in the bishop's establishments. Church officials conducted the evaluations personally, assessing women based on physical attractiveness and health. The most beautiful were directed to premium facilities like the Cardinal's Hat. Those deemed less attractive were assigned to establishments serving common laborers and sailors. The fair operated openly with church banners flying and official representatives conducting business in broad daylight. Families sometimes sold their daughters directly to these establishments, viewing it as economic transaction rather than moral failure. The church's involvement legitimized what might otherwise have been seen as trafficking. The medical inspection system demonstrated the operation's sophisticated management structure. The bishop employed physicians who conducted weekly examinations of all licensed women. These doctors checked for visible signs of disease, primarily examining skin conditions and other obvious symptoms. Women who passed received official seals of approval, small metal tokens they could display to customers as proof of health. Those who failed examinations were prohibited from working until cleared by medical authority. However, corrupt practices flourished within this system. Women could pay bribes to continue working despite failing inspections. Doctors on the bishop's payroll had financial incentives to pass as many women as possible since their positions depended on the operation's profitability. The medical inspections provided appearance of health regulation while actually serving primarily as revenue control mechanism. The protection services formed another revenue stream while creating dependency. The bishop's guards patrolled the entertainment district, preventing violence against women for a fee. They also served as collection agents when customers refused payment, acting as medieval debt collectors with legal authority behind them. Women could purchase retirement funds, essentially insurance policies that would theoretically provide for them when age made work impossible. These funds were expensive, and most women never lived long enough to collect. The average working life in this trade was brutally short. Disease, violence, and the physical toll of constant work killed most women before they reached 30. The retirement fund system enriched the church while providing false security to desperate women. Now that you have witnessed how the church industrialized what it condemned, you are beginning to see the patterns of power hidden beneath religious authority. If uncovering these buried contradictions resonates with your curiosity about how institutions really operated, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into history's most guarded hypocrisies. Because what comes next reveals how they justified this empire while burning others for far less. The Winchester model was not unique. It was the blueprint for ecclesiastical entertainment operations across Europe. In Avignon, the papal entertainment complex operated directly under Vatican control during the period when popes resided in France rather than Rome. The papal treasury collected taxes from more than 200 women working in facilities adjacent to the papal palace itself. These were not distant operations that church leadership could claim ignorance about. The buildings stood within sight of where the Pope heard confession and celebrated Mass. High-ranking church officials visiting Avignon were provided with special accommodations in these establishments, with separate luxury rooms reserved specifically for clerical guests. The hypocrisy was not hidden, but institutionalized at the highest levels of church authority. The Archbishop of Mainz controlled operations in 6 different German cities simultaneously, creating what amounted to a regional chain of church-licensed establishments. Each location operated under identical business models with standardized pricing structures and licensing requirements. The archbishop's administrators traveled between cities conducting inspections and collecting revenues. The bishop could condemn fornication from his pulpit on Sunday morning, while collecting rent from the same activity Sunday afternoon without any sense of contradiction. This brazenness reveals how completely normalized these arrangements had become. The cognitive dissonance that would shock modern sensibilities simply did not exist for medieval people accustomed to seeing religious and commercial authority as inseparable. Spanish cathedral operations often integrated entertainment facilities directly into cathedral complexes. In Seville, the cathedral entertainment facility occupied a building connected to the main church through underground tunnels. Priests could visit without being seen publicly, maintaining appearance of celibacy while accessing services privately. The tunnel system was not crude or improvised but professionally constructed as a permanent architectural feature. Women working in these facilities were required to attend special masses in designated cathedral sections. They sat in areas marked for their use while priests preached about sin and redemption. Then, these same women returned to work in church-owned buildings to service church officials. The psychological torture of this arrangement is difficult to comprehend. These women were simultaneously condemned as sinners and licensed as service providers by the same institution. The architectural evidence that survives today confirms this was no secret operation. In several European cities, buildings that once served as church-licensed establishments still stand with ecclesiastical coats of arms carved in stone above doorways. These architectural details were permanent and public, meant to be seen and recognized. They proclaimed ownership and authority. The buildings were substantial structures built to last generations, not temporary arrangements that could be quickly dismantled if exposed. The investment in architecture alone demonstrates long-term commitment to these operations as permanent business enterprises. Churches were building monuments to their own hypocrisy and seeing no contradiction. The theological gymnastics required to justify these operations reveal medieval Christianity's capacity for moral flexibility when profit was involved. Church fathers like Augustine had written centuries earlier about prostitution as necessary evil, comparing it to sewers in cities. Sewers were unpleasant, but necessary for urban sanitation. Similarly, Augustine argued, prostitution was immoral but necessary to prevent worse sexual crimes. Medieval theologians seized on this argument to justify not merely tolerating, but actively profiting from entertainment trade. If prostitution was necessary evil, then surely it was better for the Church to control and regulate it rather than leaving it to secular authorities or criminal organizations. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian whose writings formed the intellectual foundation of Catholic doctrine, provided even more detailed justification. He argued in his Summa Theologica that prohibiting prostitution entirely would lead to greater social disorder. Men denied legal outlets for lust would resort to rape, adultery, or other more destructive behaviors. By permitting regulated prostitution, society channeled male desire into controllable forms that did not threaten the institution of marriage or social stability. The fact that the Church profited from this regulation was simply practical governance. Someone had to collect taxes and maintain order. Who better than church authorities who had both moral authority and administrative capability? The Council of Constance in 1414 attempted to address the growing scandal of clerical involvement in entertainment operations. Reformers within the Church proposed strict prohibitions against clergy owning or operating such establishments. The council attracted bishops and high church officials from across Europe, all gathering to debate church reform. These attending bishops arrived with entourages that included 700 women from the entertainment industry. The women were not smuggled in secretly, but traveled openly as part of official delegations. The motion to prohibit clerical ownership of entertainment establishments came up for vote in rooms literally overlooking the largest temporary entertainment district in European history. The reform proposal failed decisively. The financial dependency was simply too great to overcome. The Council of Basel in 1431 made another attempt at reform, issuing severe condemnations of clerical participation in entertainment operations. documents denouncing the practice were drafted and approved in formal sessions. However, these condemnation documents were physically written in rooms above the city's largest entertainment establishment, which was owned by Basel's bishop. The scribes composing these denunciations of clerical sexual commerce worked in buildings where such commerce occurred on floors below them. The irony was apparently lost on participants or deemed irrelevant. The council condemned the practice in theory while continuing it in practice. The documents survive in archives as testimony to institutional cognitive dissonance on a massive scale. The penitential manuals used by priests hearing confession provide another window into this contradiction. These books listed hundreds of sexual sins with corresponding penances. They described in clinical detail every possible variation of sexual activity, assigning each a specific punishment. Priests studying these manuals to judge parishioners' confessions learned elaborate taxonomies of sexual transgression. Yet, the same priests administered sacraments in cathedrals funded by entertainment revenues. They heard confessions of sexual sin while their bishops collected taxes from the same behaviors. The manuals themselves were products of church scholarly tradition, copied and illuminated in monastic scriptoria by monks who had taken vows of celibacy. These monks produced detailed guides to sexual sin in buildings maintained by profits from sexual commerce. The selective enforcement of sexual morality reveals the power dynamics at work. Common women accused of fornication faced public humiliation, fines, or imprisonment. Women operating without episcopal license were prosecuted as criminals and sometimes executed. But women working under church license in bishop-owned establishments were legally protected. Their work was simultaneously sinful and sanctioned, immoral and official. The same act committed by a licensed woman under church authority was legal commerce. The identical act by an unlicensed woman was criminal behavior deserving severe punishment. The church claimed moral authority to define sin, while profiting from that sin when properly taxed and regulated. The regional variations in these practices demonstrate how widespread and normalized they had become. Mediterranean regions, influenced by Roman legal traditions and denser urban populations, favored the formalized licensing systems seen in Winchester and Avignon. Northern European regions often operated under slightly different arrangements, but with the same fundamental structure of church ownership and profit. German prince-bishops combined secular and religious authority, making their control of entertainment operations even more absolute. Italian city-states saw complex relationships between church authorities, civic governments, and powerful families, but church ownership of entertainment establishments remained common and accepted. The practice transcended regional differences, suggesting it fulfilled fundamental institutional needs rather than representing isolated corruption. The financial dependency created by these operations made reform nearly impossible. Cathedral construction was enormously expensive, requiring decades of sustained funding. Military campaigns to defend church territories demanded constant revenue. Supporting the elaborate lifestyles expected of high church officials required substantial wealth. Entertainment revenues provided reliable, steady income streams that could be counted on year after year. Reformers who proposed eliminating this income source had to explain how they would replace 20 to 30% of church revenues in major cities. No one could provide convincing alternatives. The financial logic was inescapable even if the moral logic was bankrupt. The human cost of this system falls heaviest on women whose lives were consumed by it. The term Winchester geese sounds almost playful to modern ears, but it marked women as fundamentally different from respectable society. These women could not marry. Their children were illegitimate with no legal rights or inheritance. When they died, they could not be buried in consecrated ground. Crossbones Graveyard in London became the final resting place for thousands of Winchester geese, a unconsecrated burial ground for women who worked under church license but were denied church burial. Archaeological excavations of this site reveal the brutal reality of their lives. Skeletal analysis shows evidence of malnutrition, untreated injuries, sexually transmitted diseases, and deaths in their 20s and 30s. The medical records that survive in church archives describe occupational health hazards in clinical terms. Physicians documented rates of disease transmission, treating it as a management problem rather than human suffering. They noted which establishments had higher infection rates and recommended different inspection frequencies. They recorded deaths in the same dispassionate tone used for recording crop yields or livestock losses. These were not people but productive assets whose health status affected revenue generation. The medical examinations themselves were often invasive and humiliating, conducted by male physicians who viewed the women as property rather than patients. The power dynamics were absolute. A physician employed by the bishop examining a woman who worked under episcopal license had no incentive to treat her as anything but commodity. The children born into the system faced impossible futures. Illegitimate children had no legal standing in medieval society. Boys born to Winchester geese could not enter trades or inherit property. Girls often had only one realistic option: following their mothers into the same work that had destroyed them. Some establishments maintained separate facilities where daughters of workers were trained from young ages. This created generational cycles of exploitation where women's bodies were literally church property across multiple generations. Breaking free was nearly impossible. Where could such a woman go? Who would hire someone marked as a Winchester goose? What skills did she possess beyond those taught in the establishments? The system was designed to trap women completely. Some women attempted escape or resistance despite impossible odds. Records from 1390 describe a woman named Alice who fled her licensed work and sought a sanctuary in a church. She claimed the establishment owner had beaten her and forced her to work while sick. Under medieval church law, criminals could claim sanctuary in churches to avoid arrest. Alice remained in the church for several weeks while legal authorities debated whether sanctuary applied to licensed entertainment workers fleeing their contracts. The bishop himself intervened, arguing that since Alice worked under church license, she remained under church jurisdiction even in sanctuary. The logic was circular and absolute. She was trying to escape church authority by claiming church sanctuary. The bishop's men eventually dragged her from the church and returned her to work. Her fate after that is unrecorded. The testimonies that survive from women who lived long enough to provide accounts reveal psychological damage as severe as physical harm. An elderly woman testifying in a 1420 inheritance dispute described her decades of licensed work in matter-of-fact terms that barely concealed deep trauma. She was sold by her father at age 12 to pay debts. She worked under license until age 47, an extraordinarily long survival in this trade. She described the constant fear, the violence from customers that authorities did nothing to prevent, the diseases that killed most of her friends, the humiliation of medical examinations, and the knowledge that the church condemned her as sinner while profiting from her body. She had outlived dozens of other women. She had saved nothing despite decades of work because fees consumed most earnings. She testified for a small inheritance from a dead customer who had shown her kindness. The court awarded her nothing. She had been Winchester Goose. That identity erased all other considerations. The archaeological evidence from medieval entertainment districts confirms the human cost in skeletal remains. Excavations at Crossbones and similar unconsecrated burial grounds reveal mortality patterns that shock modern observers. Most burials are women who died between ages 18 and 35. Many show evidence of malnutrition despite living in relatively wealthy urban areas. Bone analysis reveals repeated trauma consistent with physical abuse. Dental evidence shows poor nutrition during childhood, suggesting these women came from desperate poverty. Pelvic analysis indicates many had given birth, often multiple times, Infant burials found in the same grounds suggest high rates of infant mortality among these births. The ground itself tells story of systematic destruction of human lives for profit, carried out under church authority and blessed by church officials. You came into this story thinking medieval bishops were simply hypocrites who preached one thing and practiced another. Now you leave understanding they created entire economic systems around the very behaviors they condemned, profiting from human desperation while claiming divine authority to define morality itself. This transformation of perspective, seeing how power justifies itself through control of morality itself, is exactly why these hidden histories matter. If this journey into institutional contradiction has awakened your appetite for truth about how authority really operates, subscribing means you will continue accessing these revelations that challenge everything we are taught about the past. Your curiosity about the real mechanisms of power deserves to be fed, because while we have eliminated these specific establishments, the pattern of those in authority creating exceptions for themselves while condemning others. That story is far from over. The Protestant Reformation that began in 1517 attacked this hypocrisy as central evidence of Catholic corruption. Martin Luther's criticisms of the Church included specific denunciations of episcopal entertainment operations. He documented the Winchester system and similar operations across Europe, using them as proof that the Catholic Church had abandoned Christian morality entirely. Protestant pamphlets described in graphic detail how bishops preached celibacy while operating pleasure houses. These attacks resonated with populations who had long witnessed the contradiction without having language or authority to challenge it. The Reformation gave voice to generations of anger at seeing religious leaders profit from sin while condemning common people for the same behaviors. The gradual criminalization of these operations occurred over centuries rather than suddenly. As Protestant regions broke from Catholic authority, they often moved quickly to shut down church-licensed establishments. Catholic regions reformed more slowly, with operations continuing well into the 17th century in some areas. The Council of Trent, beginning in 1545, finally addressed the issue directly, prohibiting clergy from owning or operating entertainment establishments. However, enough documentation survived in scattered archives, legal records, and property documents to reconstruct the basic outlines of the system. Modern historians rediscovered this hidden history beginning in the 19th century when medieval archives were systematically catalogued for the first time. What survived tells story of institutional power unconstrained by the moral rules it imposed on others. The medieval church claimed absolute authority to define sin and virtue. It used this authority to create profitable monopolies in vice while condemning those same vices in others. The Winchester geese were simultaneously sinners whose sexuality was condemned and licensed workers whose sexuality was profitably regulated. This contradiction was not hidden but institutionalized at the highest levels. The hypocrisy was the system itself. Understand, they profit from human desperation while claiming moral authority. They control bodies and lives while preaching freedom. The Winchester geese are long dead, but the system that destroyed them lives on in new forms. Recognizing historical patterns helps us identify contemporary versions before they become too normalized to challenge. The medieval church got away with this contradiction for centuries because no one had authority to challenge church authority itself. We have that authority now. The question is whether we will use it.